The North Atlantic wind whipped against the face of Kapitänleutnant Hans-Günther as he stepped onto the conning tower of his Type VII-C U-boat. The cold was biting, but to him, it was the sweetest taste in the world. Beneath his leather boots lay 769 tons of German steel, a perfect predatory machine, the pride of Admiral Dönitz. But Hans wasn't standing there to admire the stars. He was there for a desperate biological and mechanical necessity. His ship needed power, and his crew needed to breathe. Below that 18mm steel skin, it was a literal hell on Earth. For the last 48 hours, the U-boat had been forced deep underwater to evade Allied destroyers. The air inside had become thick, saturated with diesel fumes, the sour stench of 44 unwashed men, molding food, and worst of all, the carbon dioxide from their own lungs. The levels had risen to a critical point. Down in the pressure hull, thinking had slowed. Commands were becoming sluggish. They were slowly dying inside their own iron coffin. Hans had given the order to surface. It was a tactical decision based on the old rules of naval warfare. Darkness is the submarine's greatest shield. In this pitch blackness, he believed the naked eye couldn't spot his small silhouette against the vast ocean. He trusted the night. He trusted the eyes of his lookouts, men trained to spot a ripple from 3 miles away. And above all, he trusted his Metox radar warning receiver, the electronic ear that was supposed to scream if an enemy radar beam swept over them. The 2 massive diesel engines roared to life, guzzling fresh air to recharge the dangerously depleted batteries. The noise of the machinery drowned out the waves. Ventilation fans purged the toxic atmosphere, replacing it with freezing, oxygen-rich air. Below decks, the crew began to wake up. They felt safe. They were in the middle of the Atlantic Black Pit, the gap where they believed Allied air patrols could not reach. But Captain Hans was making a fatal error. He was fighting a 1943 war with a 1940 mindset. He didn't realize that the rules of the game had been completely rewritten by engineers in London and Washington. Darkness was no longer his friend. The silence of his Metox receiver didn't mean he was safe. It only meant the enemy was using a frequency that German technology couldn't yet hear. Hans lit a cigarette, inhaling the mix of tobacco and sea salt. He felt like a hunter, the king of the ocean. He didn't see the heavy Liberator bomber drifting through the clouds 5 miles away. He didn't know that a state-of-the-art centimetric radar eye had already locked onto his conning tower like a spotlight in the dark. The U-boat wasn't a shark resting. It was prey serving itself up on a platter. Hans had just traded the safety of the deep for a breath of fresh air, unaware that the price of that luxury was the lives of his entire crew. High above the churning Atlantic, the Hunter was already moving into position. It was a consolidated B-24 Liberator, modified for very long-range operations. But the deadliest weapon on board wasn't the depth charges in the bay or the machine guns in the turrets. It was a small humming box of electronics sitting at the navigator's station, the ASV Mk III radar. For years, the Atlantic War had been a game of cat and mouse played in the dark. The Germans had countered early British radar with the Metox receiver, a simple wooden frame wrapped in wire, affectionately known as the Biscay Cross. It was crude, but effective. Whenever a British plane swept the ocean with its older, long-wave radar, the Metox would scream a warning through the U-boat speakers long before the aircraft got close enough to attack. It gave the German captains time to crash dive, vanishing into the safety of the deep. It was their electronic shield. Captain Hans trusted that device with his life. He looked at the silent speaker on his console and assumed the sky was empty. But he was making a fatal assumption. He didn't know that the British had just leaped forward in the electromagnetic spectrum. The engineers at the University of Birmingham had invented the cavity magnetron, a piece of technology that changed the physics of the war. This new radar didn't transmit in the long, lazy waves that the German Metox could detect. It fired pulses in the microwave spectrum, centimetric waves. These high-frequency beams were tight, focused, and completely invisible to German sensors. The Metox was listening for a shout, but the new radar was whispering. To the electronic ears of the U-boat, the night was silent. But on the green cathode ray tube in the Liberator, the submarine stood out like a neon sign against the background clutter of the waves. The pilot adjusted his heading, guided solely by the voice of the radar operator. He didn't need to see the ocean. He just needed to follow the blip. The aircraft dropped altitude, descending from the cloud layer, trading potential energy for kinetic speed. The noise of the bomber's engines was swallowed by the wind and the roar of the U-boat's own diesels. The distance closed rapidly. 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Hans was still on the bridge, finishing his cigarette, enjoying the cold air, completely unaware that a 60,000-pound executioner was rushing towards him at 200 miles an hour. The technology gap had rendered him deaf, dumb, and blind. This was the new reality of 1943. It wasn't about bravery or seamanship anymore. It was about bandwidth. The Germans were fighting a physical war, while the Allies were winning the electronic one. The trap was set, the approach was perfect, and the U-boat crew was still relaxed, joking in the fresh air, seconds away from a violence they would never see coming. 1 mile out, the radar blip on the Liberator's screen began to merge with the sea clutter. The electronic eye had done its job. It had guided the executioner to the doorstep. Now, the baton was passed to a different kind of technology. The pilot pushed the nose down, leveling out at a terrifyingly low altitude of 50 feet above the water. He was flying blind, trusting the math, trusting the radar operator's voice in his headset. On the bridge of the U-boat, the lookouts were straining their eyes into the darkness. They heard a low hum, a vibration in the air distinct from their own diesel engines. It was the sound of 4 Pratt & Whitney engines throttled back, drifting closer. Hans turned his head. He heard it too. But he saw nothing, just the endless, crushing blackness of the Atlantic night. He opened his mouth to shout an order, perhaps to clear the bridge, but the order died in his throat. In the belly of the bomber, the pilot flicked a single switch. Under the wing, the Leigh Light ignited. This wasn't a normal spotlight. It was a 24-inch carbon arc searchlight, powered by a bank of heavy accumulators, generating a beam of 22 million candle power. In a fraction of a second, the world changed from absolute zero visibility to a blinding, surgical whiteness. The effect on the German crew was physiological devastation. For hours, their eyes had been adapting to the dark, their pupils dilated wide to catch the faintest photon of starlight. When the Leigh Light hit them, it didn't just illuminate them, it incapacitated them. It was a flash blindness so severe, it induced physical pain. Hans threw his hands up, not to surrender, but because his retinas were overwhelmed. He couldn't see the plane. He couldn't see the horizon. He was trapped in a cone of white fire. This was the brilliance of the Allied system. The radar found them without warning. The light blinded them before they could react. The U-boat crew was frozen in the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. The British had hacked the loop. The Germans couldn't observe, so they couldn't orient. Panic replaced protocol. Before the alarm klaxon could even sound inside the hull, the Liberator roared over the top of them. The bomb bay doors were already open. The pilot toggled the release. A stick of 6 Torpex depth charges tumbled out in a perfect line. They weren't aimed to hit the deck. They were set with hydrostatic fuses to detonate at a specific depth, 25 feet below the surface. The goal wasn't to puncture the steel from above, but to create a hydraulic hammer beneath the keel. Hans felt the pressure wave before he heard the sound. The ocean around his ship erupted into white geysers. The U-boat, which seconds ago had been a stable platform of war, was lifted bodily by the expanding gas bubbles of the explosions. The steel hull groaned, not like metal, but like a living thing in agony. The surprise was total. The trap had sprung shut with the violence of a guillotine. The physics of a depth charge attack are cruel. When 600 pounds of Torpex detonates underwater, it doesn't just create heat and fire like a bomb in the air. It creates a shock wave moving at 5,000 feet per second. Because water is incompressible, it transmits that energy with almost zero loss. The ocean itself becomes a solid weapon, a hydraulic hammer swinging against the steel ribs of the U-boat. For the men inside the Type VII-C, the world didn't just shake, it disintegrated. The lights didn't flicker. The bulbs exploded in their sockets, plunging the boat into sudden, screaming darkness. The welds holding the pressure hull together groaned under the sudden compression. Rivets, subjected to shear forces they were never designed to handle, sheared off and became supersonic bullets, ricocheting through the cramped compartments. The fresh air they had surfaced to breathe was instantly replaced by the acrid stench of burning insulation and the terrifying, metallic taste of fear. On the bridge, Captain Hans was thrown violently against the steel railing. His ears were ringing with a deafness that would never fully clear. The blinding white light of the Liberator had vanished into the darkness, leaving only the afterimage burned into his retinas. But he didn't need to see to know the ship was dying. He could feel it through the soles of his boots. The rhythmic thrum of the diesel engines, the heartbeat of the ship, had stuttered and died. The propeller shafts, knocked out of alignment by the shockwave, had seized. The U-boat was drifting, dead in the water. Below decks, the panic was compounded by a chemical nightmare. The shockwave had cracked the casings of the massive lead-acid batteries located beneath the floorboards. As seawater from ruptured pipes began to mix with the battery acid, it created a deadly byproduct, chlorine gas. A heavy green fog began to curl around the ankles of the engineers in the aft section. It was a silent killer, searing the lungs and blinding the eyes. The very system that stored their power was now turning the ship into a gas chamber. Hans scrambled to the voice pipe. His instinct, drilled into him through years of training, screamed one command: alarm, dive, dive. It was the muscle memory of a submariner. Safety lies in the deep. But as he shouted the order, he realized the futility of it. You cannot dive a ship that has lost its structural integrity. The pressure hull, their shield against the crushing weight of the ocean, was compromised. If they submerged now, the Atlantic wouldn't hide them. It would crush them like a tin can. The Liberator pilot, banking hard for a second run, looked down. He didn't see a fearsome predator anymore. He saw a broken metal shape wallowing in the foam, leaking oil and air. The U-boat wasn't fighting back. The flak guns were silent. The crew on the bridge wasn't manning the weapons. They were struggling just to stand up. The Hunter had become a wreck in less time than it took to smoke a cigarette. The technological ambush was absolute. German steel had held against the sea, but it had shattered against the speed of Allied innovation. Captain Hans pulled himself up from the steel grating of the bridge. His uniform was torn, his face slick with a mixture of sea spray and oil. He looked at his ship and saw a dying beast. The U-boat was listing heavily to port, rolling sluggishly in the swells. It had lost its buoyancy, that delicate balance of physics that kept 70 tons of machinery afloat. Now, it was just a heavy iron weight, wanting to return to the seabed. Inside his mind, the tactical options flashed by, but they were all dead ends. This was the devil's choice that every U-boat commander feared. Option 1, dive. If they vented the ballast tanks now, they could escape the bomber. But with the pressure hull cracked and the rivets sheared, the ocean pressure at 50 meters would simply fold the boat in half. They would be crushed instantly. Option 2, stay on the surface and fight. But fighting meant standing on an open deck, exposed, trying to aim manual cannons at a flying shadow that moved at 200 miles an hour. Hans chose the surface. It was a choice made not out of hope for victory, but out of a desperate desire to die in the open air rather than in a crushed metal tube. He shouted for the gun crews, "Man the flak, fire at will." It was a brave order, but bravery had become irrelevant. The gunners stumbled up the ladder, gasping for air, their eyes streaming tears from the chlorine gas leaking below. They strapped themselves into the mounts of the 20mm anti-aircraft guns, but they were shooting at ghosts. The Liberator had extinguished its blinding Leigh Light, plunging the world back into darkness. The German gunners were firing blindly into the night sky, tracing lines of red tracer fire that hit nothing but empty air. They were fighting a visual war against an enemy who was fighting by radar. The bomber pilot could see every tracer round, adjust his approach, and line up for the kill shot with mathematical precision. The U-boat was thrashing like a wounded animal, making noise and light, only making itself an easier target. From the cockpit of the Liberator, the scene looked pathetic. The once terrifying grey wolf was now just a sparkler on the water. The pilot didn't feel hatred, he felt the cold detachment of a professional operating a superior system. He banked the heavy aircraft around, lining up for a strafing run to suppress the flak gunners before the final depth charge drop. He checked his instruments. Altitude stable, speed stable. The technological noose was tightening. Back on the bridge, Hans realized the era of the happy time, the days when U-boats roamed the Atlantic with impunity, was truly dead. He wasn't losing because he was a bad captain. He wasn't losing because his crew was cowardly. He was losing because his government had sent him to sea in a weapon that was obsolete. The Type VII-C was designed to fight ships that could be seen. It had no answer for invisible microwaves, no defense against blinding light, and no armor against the precision of aerial depth charges. He gripped the railing, watching the tracers fade into the clouds, and waited for the sound of the returning engines. The 6 minutes were almost up. The Liberator returned, but this time it brought a different kind of violence. Before the bomber released its final payload, the nose gunner and the top turret opened fire, 8 heavy Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns unleashed a converging storm of lead. This was the suppression phase of the attack, a cold, tactical calculation designed to clear the deck of any living thing before the final blow was struck. On the heaving deck of the U-boat, the German flak crews didn't stand a chance. They were trying to aim 20mm cannons at a dark shape, moving at 200 miles an hour, while the sea pitched the floor beneath them at 30-degree angles. They were brave men, but bravery cannot defy physics. The American heavy machine gun rounds, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, tore through the light steel shielding of the conning tower like paper. Sparks showered the bridge as bullets ricocheted off the hardened periscope shears. The noise was deafening, a mixture of screaming engines, hammering guns, and the terrifying clang of metal striking metal. Captain Hans huddled behind the shattered remains of the spray deflector. He watched his gunners fall, not because they were outfought, but because they were outclassed. The Allied aircraft was a stable gun platform, stabilized by aerodynamics and guided by radar. The U-boat was a chaotic, unstable raft. It was a massacre of geometry. The plane simply had the better angles, the better speed, and the better math. The resistance on the deck was silenced in seconds. With the flak guns neutralized, the Liberator pilot lined up for the coup de grace. He didn't need to hurry. He leveled the wings, adjusted the trim, and flew a perfect, straight line over the crippled submarine. The bomb bay doors yawned open again. This time, there was no surprise, just the mechanical inevitability of the kill. 4 more depth charges tumbled out, spaced perfectly to straddle the target 2 to land on the port side, 2 on the starboard side. The intent was to create a water hammer effect from both sides simultaneously, squeezing the U-boat hull in a vice of high-pressure shockwaves. When they detonated, the ocean didn't just lift the boat, it broke its back. The structural keel, the spine of the ship, snapped under the dual impact. The sound was different this time, not a boom, but a sickening, metallic screech as steel plates tore apart. The U-boat stopped rolling. It settled heavily into the water, the bow rising sluggishly towards the sky. The buoyancy tanks, now ruptured and venting air, flooded instantly with hundreds of tons of seawater. The fight was over. The predator that had terrorized the Atlantic shipping lanes, the invisible ghost that struck fear into the hearts of merchant sailors, was reduced to a broken collection of scrap metal. Hans looked at his watch. It had been exactly 5 minutes and 40 seconds since he gave the order to surface. The fresh air he had craved so badly was now the only thing surrounding him, while his ship began its final, long slide into the abyss. The final moments of a U-boat are a study in terrifying physics. As the structural spine of the ship snapped, the laws of buoyancy were inverted. The Type VII-C, designed to displace water and remain buoyant, was now actively sucking the ocean inside. Thousands of gallons of freezing Atlantic water rushed through the shattered hull plates, displacing the air that kept them alive. The bow rose sharply, pointing towards the moon like a jagged steel finger, before beginning the final, accelerating slide backward. On the bridge, Captain Hans didn't have to give the order to abandon ship. The ocean gave it for him. As the angle of the deck steepened past 45 degrees, gravity took over. Men who were clinging to the railings were torn loose, sliding helplessly into the churning black water. Hans held on for a second longer, looking down through the open hatch of the conning tower. He didn't see his crew. He saw only a rising tide of green foam and the flickering sparks of dying electrical circuits. The screams from below were cut short, not by silence, but by the roar of the rushing sea. He let go. The shock of the water was instantaneous, a freezing hammer blow that squeezed the air from his lungs. The Atlantic in May is unforgiving, barely a few degrees above freezing. It paralyzes the muscles and slows the heart, but Hans kicked away from the hull, driven by the instinct to escape the suction. A sinking 70-meter vessel creates a vortex, a deadly whirlpool that drags everything nearby down with it. He swam through the oil slick, the thick, choking sludge coating his eyes and filling his mouth, making it impossible to breathe or see. Behind him, the U-boat began its terminal dive. It didn't go quietly. As the stern dragged the bow under, the trapped air pockets inside the hull began to compress. The hull groaned and shrieked as bulkhead after bulkhead collapsed under the mounting hydrostatic pressure. This wasn't just a ship sinking, it was a pressurized steel tube being crushed by the fist of the ocean. The men trapped inside, the engineers, the radio operators, the torpedo men, didn't drown. They were crushed by the implosion of their own sanctuary. The Liberator circled overhead, a dark hawk watching its prey disappear. The pilot saw the white foam of the disturbance vanish, replaced by a large, spreading stain of diesel fuel and debris. The radar blip that had guided them there, the glowing green dot that represented 70 men and 1,000,000 Reichsmarks of technology, flickered and vanished from the screen. The ocean surface was empty again. The 6-minute execution was complete. Floating in the freezing darkness, treading water in a soup of oil and wreckage, Hans realized the true horror of his situation. He was alive, but he was alone. The U-boat arm was built on the concept of the wolf pack's strength in numbers, hunting together. But in death, every U-boat is an island. The radio was gone. The Enigma machine was sinking to the bottom. No distress signal had been sent because the attack had been too fast, too violent. Berlin didn't know he was lost. The convoy he was hunting didn't know he was there. He was a speck of biological matter floating in 1,000,000 square miles of indifference. The technology that had killed his ship had also ensured his absolute isolation. The silence that follows a battle at sea is heavier than anywhere else on Earth. There are no burning ruins to mark the spot, no craters in the ground. The ocean simply swallows the violence and returns to a rhythmic, indifferent calm. Captain Hans, clinging to a piece of floating debris in the freezing swell, was witnessing the end of an era, though he didn't know it yet. He was just one man in the water, but his fate was being replicated across the entire North Atlantic. This sinking was not an isolated incident. It was part of a synchronized slaughter. Historians would later call this month Black May of 1943. In just 31 days, the Allies didn't just sink a few submarines. They wiped out 41 U-boats. That is more than one per day. A quarter of the entire operational German submarine fleet was erased from existence in a single month. It was a rate of attrition that no military force in history could sustain. For years, the German High Command had relied on a simple mathematical formula. If they could sink Allied merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would starve. They called it tonnage warfare. But in May 1943, the equation flipped. The hunters became the hunted. The U-boats were no longer sinking ships. They were being sunk before they could even fire a torpedo. The exchange ratio had become suicidal. From his headquarters in Paris, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz watched the pins disappear from his situation map with growing horror. He was a man of cold logic, not prone to panic, but the reports coming in were impossible to ignore. U-boats were vanishing without sending distress signals. Veteran aces, men with iron crosses and years of experience, were leaving port and never checking in again. The Wolfpack tactic, which had terrified the world, relied on a single premise: invisibility. The packs needed to find the convoys, gather on the surface, and strike together. But you cannot gather if the enemy can see you from the sky. You cannot strike if you are dead before you get within range. The Allied system had achieved synergy. It wasn't just the radar, or the Leigh Light, or the long-range bombers, or the code breakers at Bletchley Park who were reading the German Enigma signals. It was all of them working together. The code breakers told the bombers where to look. The radar helped them find the exact location. The light blinded the target. The depth charges finished the job. It was a perfectly integrated kill chain, an industrial assembly line of destruction against which individual bravery was useless. On May 24th, 1943, just days after Hans's boat went down, Admiral Dönitz made the most painful decision of the naval war. He sent a coded signal to all remaining U-boats in the North Atlantic. Withdraw. He pulled the Wolfpacks back. He admitted defeat. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most critical campaign of the war, was effectively over. The German Navy didn't lose because they ran out of torpedoes or fuel. They lost because they ran out of darkness. The technology gap had become a chasm that no amount of fanaticism could bridge. Captain Hans, freezing to death in the oil-slicked water, was the final proof that the age of the invisible submarine had ended. The sinking of Captain Hans's U-boat was not an anomaly. It was a data point in the grisliest statistic of World War II. As the war dragged on, the U-boat service, the Kriegsmarine, achieved a distinction that no military unit ever wants. They suffered the highest casualty rate of any armed force in the history of modern warfare. Out of the 40,900 men who sailed on U-boats, 28,000 never returned. That is a death rate of 75%. 3 out of every 4 men who stepped into those iron tubes were sailing to their graves. By late 1943, the term Iron Coffin was no longer a dark joke among the crews. It was a literal description of their working environment. The veteran commanders were dead. The training programs were shortened. The average life expectancy of a new U-boat crew in the Atlantic dropped to just 2 patrols. Sometimes it was measured in days. Young men, barely out of their teens, were being sent to sea in Type VII boats that were technologically obsolete before they even left the dock. They were fighting against an enemy who controlled the air, the radio waves, and the encryption codes. The German engineers tried to adapt. They introduced the Schnorchel, a breathing tube that allowed U-boats to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth. It was designed to counter the radar threat, to let the boats stay underwater indefinitely. But it was a desperate, defensive measure. It turned the U-boat from a proud hunter into a timid creature that had to hide just to breathe. It made them slow, deaf, and blind. And even the Schnorchel had a fatal flaw. The head of the valve was coated in a material that reflected radar waves, creating a small but distinct blip that the new Allied high-resolution radars could still detect. The psychological toll was catastrophic. In the early years, U-boat crews were the elite, treated like rock stars when they returned to base in France. Now, they were ghosts. They would leave the concrete bunkers of Lorient or Street, Nazaire, looking at the sun and the sky, with the heavy realization that they would likely never see them again. The morale didn't break because of cowardice. It broke because of math. When you know that the enemy can see you in the dark, hear you in the silence, and predict your movements before you make them, courage becomes irrelevant. The technological dominance of the Allies had created a scenario where skill no longer mattered. A rookie pilot in a Liberator bomber, guided by a computer, could kill an expert U-boat ace with 20 years of experience. The human factor had been removed from the equation. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned into a mechanized slaughterhouse, where flesh and blood were fed into a grinder of sonar, radar, and high explosives. The ocean floor was being paved with the wreckage of a failed strategy, and Captain Hans was just one more piece of debris in a vast, underwater graveyard. Captain Hans was never found. His body, like thousands of others, became part of the Atlantic's vast, unmarked history. But his death tells a story far bigger than one U-boat. It tells the story of how Germany lost the war. They didn't lose because they lacked courage. The U-boat crews were arguably the bravest men in the conflict. They lost because they bet on the wrong variable. They bet on the superweapon, the individual, high-quality machine crewed by elite warriors. The Allies, on the other hand, bet on the system. They understood that modern warfare isn't a duel between knights. It is an industrial process. They built a kill chain that integrated science, industry, intelligence, and logistics into a single, overwhelming force. The Liberator bomber that killed Hans wasn't just an airplane. It was the delivery mechanism for a global network of radar stations, code-breaking computers, and mass production factories. Against that system, the individual skill of a German captain was mathematically irrelevant. The 6 minutes that cost Hans his life were not just a span of time. They represented a technological singularity. In those few minutes, the ancient rules of naval warfare, stealth, visual spotting, and seamanship were erased and replaced by the cold logic of the electronic age. The U-boat, once the ultimate predator, had been reduced to a helpless target, trapped in a game where the enemy could see through walls and strike from the heavens. Ultimately, the Battle of the Atlantic teaches us a brutal lesson about innovation. If you stop evolving, you die. The Germans hesitated. They delayed the development of their own advanced radars. They ignored the warnings about their compromised codes. They trusted in the thickness of their steel when they should have been worrying about the frequency of the waves. They surfaced for fresh air in a world that had become toxic to their existence. So, when we look back at the grey wolves of the Atlantic, we shouldn't just see the terror they inflicted. We should see them as a warning. No matter how strong your armor, no matter how deep you dive, you cannot hide from a superior system. The captain ignored the reality of the new war, and 6 minutes later, he was gone. If you found this analysis of systemic collapse compelling, please like and subscribe. We don't just tell stories of battles, we deconstruct the engineering and strategy that decided them. Let us know in the comments. Do you think the new Type 21 electroboat could have changed the war if it had arrived sooner? Or was the Allied system already too powerful to stop? For more stories about how technology defeated tactics, check out the video on the screen right now.